Caleb and Meredith Langston had only been married 9 days when they vanished. They weren't eloping, and they weren't running from anything. They were just two people in love, celebrating their honeymoon the way they'd planned for months, quietly, without fanfare, surrounded by nature. Both had grown up hiking, backpacking, and spending summers volunteering for conservation projects. Meredith worked as a pediatric nurse in Knoxville. Caleb taught high school English. They had steady jobs, good health, no enemies, no debts. When they checked into a small private cabin near Greenbrier, Tennessee, just outside the Smoky Mountains National Park, they weren't looking for adventure. They were just looking for peace. They'd rented the cabin for 2 nights. It was cozy, quiet, and surrounded by woods, the kind of place people go to recharge. They unpacked the groceries, made coffee, took a photo on the porch. That was on a Monday. By Wednesday morning, they were gone. According to the cabin's owner, they were last seen that afternoon walking hand in hand toward the road with light day packs and a printed park map. It was sunny, 65 degrees, no rain in the forecast. They left their phones charging in the cabin. That wasn't unusual. Cell reception was poor in the area, and they'd told family they were unplugging. Meredith had left a message on her sister's voicemail that morning, saying they were going to try a short trail they'd read about online, and that they'd be back by dinner time. That message was the last time anyone heard her voice. When the Langstons didn't check out the next morning, the cabin owner knocked on the door, then again an hour later. Inside, everything was tidy. The bed was made, the dishes rinsed, their phones were still plugged in. The only thing missing were the 2 small hiking packs. No signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle. But the car was also gone. That was what triggered the first real concern. When he drove up to the nearby trailhead, Ramsey Cascades, a relatively popular out-and-back route, he saw it parked neatly in the gravel lot, passenger window cracked slightly, keys on the front seat. No one was around. By 4:00 p.m., he called the local sheriff. The initial assumption wasn't foul play. They were hikers in a national park. People go off trail. People miscalculate distances. They twist an ankle or take a wrong turn. But when the search began that evening, with park rangers walking the main trail by flashlight and calling their names into the trees, no response came. That night it dropped to 40 degrees, and the next morning the first full search and rescue team arrived. Dogs, drones, maps, and coordinated volunteers. But something was already off. No one had passed them on the trail that day. No rangers remembered seeing them sign the voluntary hiker log. It was as if they'd entered the woods and vanished within minutes. Their car offered no real clues. It was locked, undisturbed. Inside were water bottles, granola bars, and a spare jacket. Meredith's purse was on the floor of the passenger side, zipped, with her wallet and ID still inside. Caleb's favorite flannel shirt was folded on the back seat. Their last known movement, confirmed by time-stamped security footage from a gas station 10 miles away, was at 11:42 a.m. that morning. They'd bought a bottle of sunscreen, 2 sandwiches, and a single bottle of Gatorade. That same bottle, still unopened, would be found 2 weeks later just off the trail, lodged between 2 rocks near a stream bed. The Langstons' families arrived within days. Meredith's father, a retired firefighter, spent hours on foot with search crews, retracing every map trail. Caleb's younger brother flew in from Chicago and organized maps and photographs into a wall-sized chart in the cabin's living room. Everyone wanted to believe the same thing, that the couple had gotten turned around, had found shelter, and were waiting to be found. But the Smoky Mountains can swallow people. Dense foliage, sudden cliffs, caves, hidden creeks, and animal dens. The landscape is beautiful, but it's easy to underestimate. Despite a full week of organized search, nothing conclusive turned up. No clothing, no prints, no blood, no gear. Rangers reported how odd it was that not even a scarf or wrapper had surfaced. No dropped phone, no radio call, no accidental trace, as if they'd walked into a different time and place. A veteran ranger whispered to a colleague on the 3rd day, "This isn't lost, this is gone." The phrase stuck. By the 8th day, the official search was scaled back. Unofficial efforts continued for months. Private searchers, amateur detectives, and online forums offered theories ranging from bear attacks to illicit poaching camps to secret survivalist cults. But none of those theories matched the facts, or lack of them. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence of predation, and no verified sightings. By the end of October, a cold wind swept through the valley. Leaves covered old trails, creek beds ran low. And the Langstons remained missing. They were eventually listed as presumed dead, cause unknown. A pair of engraved stones were placed by their families in a Knoxville cemetery. 2 names, 1 date, no bodies, just silence, and a car that never left the trailhead. 10 years later, that same silence would break, but not the way anyone expected, not until a dog, wandering too far from his owner, began to dig. By the morning after their disappearance, the search for Caleb and Meredith Langston was already underway. The urgency wasn't driven by panic, not yet. It was protocol. 2 healthy, capable hikers didn't return from a well-marked trail. It happened occasionally. People lost track of time. They wandered off course. They took shelter and waited. That's what the initial responders believed. But before the first full day was over, that belief started to unravel. And what followed, no one could quite explain. Search and rescue teams arrived early, setting up a base near the Ramsey Cascades trailhead where the Langstons' car had been found. The vehicle itself offered nothing suspicious, no signs of a break-in, no scattered belongings. The keys were still on the passenger seat, the windows slightly cracked. It was the kind of thing experienced hikers sometimes did: lock up, pack light, return before dusk. Only this time, dusk had come and gone, and there were no signs of where they'd gone after stepping away from that gravel lot. 2 K9 units were brought in that afternoon. 1 dog started at the car, nose to the ground, tugging steadily toward the main trailhead. The other circled a bit, then abruptly veered toward a less used branch path, narrower, less trafficked, leading deeper into the wooded slope. After a moment of hesitation, both handlers allowed the dogs to guide the direction. The scent trail was strong. Confidence. And then it wasn't. Roughly 3/4 of a mile in, both dogs stopped. Not from fatigue or confusion, but as if whatever they were following simply ended. The handlers described it as hitting a wall. They circled back, tried again, expanded the perimeter, but nothing. No continuation, no loop back. The scent of Caleb and Meredith was just gone. That was when Ranger Jonathan Reese, one of the senior officers on site, started examining the terrain more carefully. The ground, still dry from the previous few days, held soft patches of earth and visible impressions. What he found made him stop short. There were 2 sets of footprints at the entry to that side trail, one slightly wider stride, the other narrower, both consistent with hiking boots and trail shoes. They walked side by side for a few hundred feet, perfectly normal, but no prints ever came out, no turnarounds, no drag marks, just 2 people going in. That was it. Reese marked the location with flags and radioed it in. He wasn't ready to call it a clue yet, but by nightfall, it became the only thing resembling one. The following day, a larger team arrived. Rangers, deputies, volunteers, a helicopter crew, and several more scent dogs. The side path was searched end to end, expanding into adjoining ridges and creek beds. No sign of a camp, no dropped gear, no torn clothing. No disturbance of any kind. Caleb and Meredith's names were called over megaphones. A whistle pattern was used at intervals. Nothing came back. The woods were thick, yes, but the trail was manageable, well marked, not especially remote. They should have been found, if not immediately, then soon. But there was nothing. On the 3rd day, the weather shifted. The forecast had hinted at light rain, but what came down was heavier. Cold sheets of water fell through the night, flooding low trails and carving rivulets through the soft ground. When morning came, the earth was no longer holding prints. Whatever evidence had existed in the soil was gone, washed into creek beds or sealed under new mud. The rain hadn't just made the search harder, it had erased its most promising trail. Even so, the teams pushed deeper. Over the next several days, aerial units scanned for heat signatures. Drones were flown across ravines and dense canopy. Rappelling teams explored sinkholes and ledges. Volunteers combed brush in tight formation, but nothing turned up. Not a jacket, not a scrap of paper, not a broken twig out of place. Meredith's parents joined the command post. Her father, a former fire chief, walked with teams, helped carry gear. asked the same quiet question over and over. If they got lost, where are they now? But they weren't just lost. That was becoming clear. Lost people leave signs. They make noise. They move. They try to be found. And even when they can't call out, something usually turns up. A shoe, a bag, a fall sight, a final signal. But there was none of that here. Only those two sets of prints walking into the woods, and nothing more. Speculation began to swirl, quietly at first. Maybe they'd staged it. Maybe they didn't want to be found. But nothing supported that. Caleb and Meredith had made future plans, vacation bookings, emails confirming work schedules. Their credit cards were untouched. Their passports were still in the cabin. They hadn't run. They hadn't hidden. They had gone for a day hike. By the end of the 6th day, the search was scaled back. Teams were rotated out. The media coverage slowed. Investigators kept the case open, but without a crime scene, there was no direction. The Langstons weren't the first people to disappear in the Smokies, but they were among the most unexplainable. Not a fall, not an animal encounter, not even a wrong turn. Just two people walking into a narrow trail, their scent going cold, and a forest that seemed to hold them without trace. The area was eventually labeled treacherous. Rangers rerouted parts of the trail system, citing erosion risks. But off the record, some of them admitted they just didn't like the feel of that stretch anymore. Something about it stuck with them. The silence, the dead scent, the footprints that never came back. One ranger called it a place where the woods closed in. That phrase would resurface years later, long after most had stopped talking about the Langstons, long after anyone believed answers were still coming, until something buried beneath the surface began to push its way back up. It was 2 weeks after the search ended when the camera was found, packed neatly in the side pouch of Caleb's hiking bag, which had remained undisturbed in the cabin, zipped right where they left it. In the rush to mobilize the search, the small black digital camera had been overlooked, tucked beneath a rain poncho and a trail guidebook. The bag had been stored with the rest of their belongings and returned to family once the case was officially deemed cold. Meredith's sister, Allison, was the one who unzipped it at home. She wasn't looking for evidence. She just wanted to see their last day, what they saw, what they smiled at, what the world looked like in the hours before it swallowed them whole. There were 13 photos in total. The first few were what you'd expect. Meredith holding a thermos, Caleb pointing toward trail markers, both of them posing under the canopy of yellowed leaves. They looked relaxed, maybe a little tired, but happy. A couple of the shots were slightly out of focus, taken in motion. One showed Meredith squinting into the sun by a shallow creek bed, her boots off, toes in the water. Another showed Caleb pretending to stumble dramatically over a log, the kind of photos couples take to preserve the mood, not the moment, until the last one. The final image was different, blurred, off-center, taken at an odd angle, as if the camera had been lifted suddenly or dropped mid-click. Trees dominate the frame. The foreground is bright and close, likely from the afternoon sun reflecting off a rock. But in the background, half-shaded, deep in the tree line, there's a human figure. Small in the frame, barely recognizable, but there, upright, mid-stride, facing the camera, too far away to identify details, but close enough that the shape isn't an illusion. Shoulders, arms, head tilted slightly. The figure appears to be walking behind them or toward where the photo was taken. Allison noticed it immediately. Her fingers froze over the zoom button. She thought maybe it was a tree at first, some natural trick of the light, but as she adjusted contrast and sharpened the edges, the outline became more deliberate. It was a person. Someone was there. She called the sheriff's office. They sent an officer to retrieve the memory card. Forensics confirmed the photo's timestamp, October 16th, 3:27 p.m., matching the time frame of their presumed hike. Investigators ran it through enhancement software. They couldn't identify the figure. No face visible, no distinguishing marks, just someone where no one should have been. Theories swirled again. Could someone have followed them? A stranger in the woods? A hunter? A local? But no one else had signed into the voluntary hiker's log that day. No reports of other visitors in that area. No other cars were logged at the trailhead. And more importantly, no prints, no scent trails, no exit path. If someone was following, they left even less trace than Caleb and Meredith did. Investigators leaned toward the simplest explanation, a coincidence. A passerby was caught unintentionally in the background of a spontaneous photo, a hiker on another trail, a local cutting through, not necessarily sinister. Not necessarily anything. But Allison didn't believe it. Neither did Caleb's brother. They said Meredith wouldn't have taken a photo by accident. She was deliberate. She was aware. If she clicked that shutter, she saw something worth documenting. The angle suggested movement, like the camera had been lifted quickly, maybe even reflexively, as if she'd heard something, turned, and snapped. Still, no official action was taken. The figure was too blurry to match against any known missing persons or suspects. No criminal offense could be tied to a background shape. The file was logged, the image stored, the case left unchanged. But among the family, it became the photo, the one they returned to late at night, the one they stared at too long, the one they hoped might eventually tell them something new. Allison kept a copy on her phone. She showed it to a forensic imaging specialist she met at a conference months later. He tried to clarify the image further, but hit a wall. Digital noise, pixel distortion, motion blur, all common, all limiting. He said the human eye sees patterns, even in randomness. Sometimes we want to see something there. But he also admitted, off the record, that the posture, the stride, the symmetry of the shoulders, it looked like someone walking with intent. It became a quiet fixation, not for the public. Most never saw the photo. It was too ambiguous, too easily dismissed. But within the family, it hovered like a question no one could answer. Who was that person? Why were they there? Were they watching? Were they waiting? The cabin owner was contacted again. He said he hadn't rented to anyone else that week. No suspicious guests, no hikers he could recall. He'd seen the Langstons leave that day, waved to them as they passed. They looked normal, smiling, holding hands. He never saw them return. 10 years later, the camera still sits in a drawer in Allison's house, beside the old trail map and the copy of Meredith's wedding vows. The memory card has been duplicated, backed up, and uploaded to every place that might someday see it clearer. But the photo never changed. That shape, still half-shadowed, still faceless, stood frozen behind them. And when the discovery came, when the dirt was finally disturbed, when the silence finally cracked, what they found would bring that photo roaring back into focus. Because the shape in the trees wasn't the only one who'd been there that day. 3 weeks after the search was called off, a woman named Dana Hollis stepped forward with a story. She worked part-time at a roadside bar and grill off Highway 321, a place mostly frequented by hikers, hunters, and the occasional local contractor. On the afternoon of October 16th, the day Caleb and Meredith went missing, she'd been outside during her smoke break, looking toward the turnout that overlooked a bend in the valley. Just across the road, a red pickup had pulled into the gravel patch near the scenic overlook. Donna said she didn't think much of it at first. It wasn't unusual for trucks to idle there for a bit, especially during leaf season. But what caught her attention wasn't the truck. It was the argument. She said there were 3 people, 2 standing close together, a man and a woman, and a third figure leaning against the truck, arms crossed. From where she stood, maybe 60 yards off, she couldn't hear exact words, but the posture was sharp. The man by the truck was tall, wearing camo hunting gear, a dark hat pulled low. The couple looked upset. The woman gestured, like pointing at something or someone. At one point, the man with her took a step forward, hands half raised, and the guy by the truck didn't move, just stared. Then, abruptly, the couple turned and walked away, toward the trailhead across the road, disappearing behind a line of trees. The truck stayed parked for another 5 minutes, then backed out and drove off toward the highway. She didn't think about it again until she saw their faces on the news. The detail was specific. A red pickup, hunting gear, scenic overlook. The time and date matched. Dana described the man's posture, his clothes, and even a dull dent near the rear left fender. It was enough to send investigators back into motion. Roadblocks were considered. Camera footage from nearby gas stations was reviewed. Officers drove the length of the park road asking about red trucks. But the trail cooled fast. There were no license plate sightings, no security cams aimed at that turnout, no neighboring businesses with exterior footage. It was as if the truck, and whoever was driving it, vanished. They widened the net, ran searches on registered red pickups within a 50-mile radius. checked hunting license holders active in the region that month, interviewed outfitters, guides, and seasonal workers. No matches. No one recalled seeing anyone like the man Dana described. The scenic overlook remained empty. The dented red truck didn't show up again. And the couple seen walking into the trees, if it was Caleb and Meredith, were never seen again either. Publicly, investigators stopped short of calling it a break in the case. It was a tip, a sighting, unconfirmed. But off the record, several believed the story. Dana wasn't someone chasing attention. She came forward quietly, didn't demand money, and stuck to her statement. She said the way the couple walked away wasn't angry. It was tight, nervous, controlled, like they didn't want to escalate something they didn't understand. Theories spun out. Online forums latched onto the truck. Some said it was a local. Others suggested an out-of-towner with a record. But one theory gained quiet traction among longtime residents, people who knew the mountains not from brochures but from years of living in their shadow. They spoke of men who lived off-grid, not the romantic kind who homestead or grow vegetables, but the ones who don't want to be found. People who know the land better than the rangers do. People who avoid trailheads, skip licenses, and disappear behind private fences or unmarked paths. The kind of man who might drive an unregistered vehicle and vanish into a place no map covers. The kind of man you don't argue with at a lookout. Law enforcement never confirmed the theory, but they didn't rule it out either. In private, one deputy admitted the woods had places even search teams wouldn't go without a full crew. Old game trails, abandoned cabins, sinkholes not listed on geological surveys, miles of terrain dense enough to hide anything, or anyone. Still, without a plate, a name, or a second witness, the lead stalled. A sketch artist tried to work with Dana, but the distance made it hard. The man in the truck remained a silhouette, broad-shouldered, unshaven, wearing a hat and sunglasses, no unique scars, no voice, just a shape that stood too still. The truck became the symbol of a mystery that wouldn't give anything back. A vehicle no one could find, connected to two people no one could explain. Meredith's sister couldn't let it go. She drove the road herself multiple times, stopping at every overlook, watching for any trace of red paint or camo gear. She asked bar owners and gas attendants. She printed flyers showing the truck's description, though it had never been photographed. To her, the sighting explained the blurred figure in the last photo. Maybe not the same person, but maybe the same presence. Someone watching, someone is waiting, someone they tried to get away from. Years later, the story still lingered. Some rangers said they occasionally spotted red paint flecks on old tree bark, but no vehicle. Some hikers claimed they'd seen a similar man watching from behind ridges, never speaking, all unconfirmed, all shadows. But when the discovery finally came, buried beneath roots near a long abandoned footpath, there was no mistaking it. The forest had held its silence long enough, and under layers of time and earth, something surfaced, something that made the red truck feel very real again. By winter, the energy behind the Langston investigation had slowed to a quiet crawl. The flyers were fading from grocery store windows. The search maps had been rolled and boxed. Volunteers went home. The dogs stopped coming. And without suspects, without witnesses, and without bodies, the investigators were left circling a hard, uncomfortable question. What if no one took them? What if they took themselves? It wasn't something the families wanted to hear. It wasn't something anyone wanted to consider. But cases don't always get solved by looking outward. Sometimes they require looking back at the people in the center of it all. In the absence of predators or pursuers, a new theory began to surface behind closed doors. Maybe the Langstons didn't vanish because something happened to them. Maybe they vanished because they chose to, or worse, because one of them chose to make the other disappear. At first glance, the idea seemed desperate. Caleb and Meredith were newlyweds. There were no fights, no history of violence, no financial stress. Their texts, emails, and browser histories showed nothing alarming. But cold cases make room for possibilities that don't fit cleanly. One detective flagged the details about their phones being left behind. That wasn't impossible. Plenty of hikers disconnected intentionally. But both? Even on a short hike? Another pointed out that Meredith had once researched hiking disappearances. A Reddit post she'd bookmarked months earlier discussed how easy it would be to vanish in a national park and never be found. It was speculative, not sinister. But in the void, it added weight. The theory bifurcated. One version suggested a joint plan, an orchestrated disappearance. The couple drops everything, disappears into the wild, starts over, but it didn't hold. Their accounts remained untouched, no money moved, no gas purchases, no passports taken, and they hadn't emptied anything out. In fact, all signs pointed to them planning to return. Groceries half used in the cabin, a load of laundry started, a dinner reservation card in Meredith's bag. The darker version centered on a murder-suicide, that perhaps an argument on the trail turned deadly. One of them snapped, killed the other, then took their own life in the aftermath. The forest was large enough to hide such a thing. But again, no signs supported it. No blood, no scattered remains, no scent trails past the stopping point. Rangers maintained that even in heavily wooded terrain, some sign would usually emerge, especially with dozens of trained eyes on the ground. Still, the theory lingered. A few online threads picked it up and ran with it, as people always do, making assumptions based on body language and old photos, spinning entire narratives from nothing. One YouTube channel called it a lover's pact and suggested Caleb had grown tired of modern life. Another floated the idea that Meredith had discovered something and staged her own disappearance to escape it. The families fought back hard. They issued public statements, went on radio shows, begged people to stop treating speculation as truth. But the damage was done. The uncertainty had spread. By the 1-year mark, the case was largely silent. A few rangers still brought it up during training sessions, mostly as a reminder of how fast the woods could take someone. A new officer assigned to the sector was told only this: watch the side trails, watch the silence. The Langstons went that way. And then, almost exactly a year later, the silence broke again. In late October of the following year, 2 hikers from Asheville were exploring a less-traveled path near Greenbrier, several miles east of where Caleb and Meredith were last seen. It was late in the afternoon. Sun was dropping fast. The 2 men, friends since college, had stopped for water when they heard it, a high-pitched scream echoing through the forest, short, sharp, then silence. They froze. A moment passed, then came a second, longer, broken at the end. They described it as human, female possibly, too distant to locate exactly, but not so far they imagined it. They called it in. Rangers responded within hours. A small team deployed, combing the area with flashlights and flare markers. They found no people. But beneath a low outcrop, in a shallow depression covered in moss and leaves, they did find something. A partial carcass, not human. The remains of a doe, partially consumed, scattered in a way that suggested predation. Blood on the rocks, claw marks on the bark, bears maybe, coyotes more likely. But something had hunted here, and the screams were likely a delayed echo of that event. Officially, the report was closed under wildlife disturbance. No new clues, no connection. But for the Langstons' families, it reopened something they'd tried to quiet. If screams could be heard after a year, what might have gone unheard that first night? If one carcass could be found near the same trail system, what else had the forest buried deeper? The suspicion turned inward again. Not toward the couple, but toward the investigation itself. Had something been missed? Had too much been assumed? And were there answers still lying just beyond the perimeter of the trail where the dogs had stopped, where the prints had ended? Whatever comfort time was supposed to bring hadn't arrived. Not for the families, not for the searchers, and certainly not for the ones who still walked the smoky trails with quiet eyes, remembering the story of the Newlyweds who never came back. Because while the world was starting to forget, the forest wasn't finished. Something still waited, beneath bark and root and silence, something buried. Something that would not stay hidden forever. 3 years after Caleb and Meredith vanished, their names had all but faded from headlines. The case was cold, the forest unchanged, families held vigils, anniversaries passed in silence, and every so often a new hiker would bring up the story like a local legend. Something tragic, but distant. And then, in the spring of 2016, a man named Len Withers made a discovery no one could quite explain. Len wasn't law enforcement. He was a civilian tracker, former military, now working privately, mostly hired to locate missing persons or wayward hikers when official channels gave up. That April, he was in the Smokies on a different case, searching for an older man who'd left a note in his car and walked into the woods alone. It wasn't uncommon. Grief, illness, despair, they often ended in isolation. Len had done this kind of work before. But what he found wasn't a person, it was a tree. He'd taken a detour off a fire road late in the afternoon. The brush was dense, but something about the terrain felt odd, paths that didn't follow topography, a faint smell of rust in the air. Then he noticed the tree, an old red oak with a hollowed-out base, not burned, not naturally weathered, cut deliberately. And inside, protected from wind and rot, was a rolled scrap of paper pinned with a rusted nail to the inner trunk. Len opened it, expecting a note or maybe an old hunting permit. But it was a map. Hand-drawn in charcoal or pencil, the map was crude but surprisingly detailed. Not a topographical rendering, but a layout. Paths, markers, ridges. There was no legend, no labels. But in the center, encircled by jagged lines that could have been elevation or barriers, was a symbol. A square inside a circle, precise, deliberate, darker than the rest. It was the only thing shaded in. Len took photos, bagged the map, marked the GPS, and reported it the next morning to the regional ranger station. The search and rescue coordinator on duty knew the area well. What struck him wasn't just the map itself, it was where it pointed. The marked zone didn't align with any known trail systems, not even the unofficial ones. It was deep, remote, and avoided. No public access points, no campgrounds, just forest. A team was formed to check the location. It took nearly 2 hours of hiking and bushwhacking to get close. The terrain was rough, with narrow game trails and eroded ridges. When they reached the general area circled on the map, they didn't find a cabin or a grave, or anything that would obviously link to the Langston case, or any case. But what they did find was strange. Scattered across a quarter-mile radius were remnants of old camps. Not modern campsites, not tents or fire rings. These were low-clearance structures, partially collapsed lean-tos made of saplings and bark. A few rusted tools, pliers, snare wire, a belt buckle, and several animal traps. Ancient, corroded, illegal by today's standards. Some are still set. Some are grown over by moss. Whoever used them hadn't been here recently, but someone had once. Photos were taken, soil was tested, nothing matched Caleb or Meredith's DNA, and no personal items were found. The camps had clearly been abandoned for years, but the question remained, why mark it? Why preserve the map inside a hollowed tree? And what did the symbol mean? Law enforcement reviewed the finding, and while they couldn't make a direct connection to any open case, the location was officially recorded as a site of interest. One officer noted that the square and circle symbol resembled a few things: military coordinates, occult markings, even old land surveyor shorthand. But none matched exactly. In local folklore, it didn't carry any specific meaning either, just a shape, just a center. The map reignited interest in the Langston case briefly. The media picked it up again, framed with headlines like, "Coded map may reveal Smoky Mountain secrets." But the buzz faded as quickly as it came. Without proof, without names, it became another unexplained clue in a case already heavy with them. Still, the symbol lingered in certain circles, shared on forums, dissected by amateur sleuths, added to conspiracy threads involving other disappearances in the region. One ranger theorized it could have been left by someone who'd once lived off-grid in the forest. A trapper, a squatter, maybe someone who didn't want company. Others believed it was older than that, some remnant of wartime training zones or long-forgotten navigation systems, but no one could say for sure. And whoever made the map never came forward. Len Withers returned to the site once more that fall. He brought newer gear, a better GPS, and a hunch he couldn't quite explain. He said it felt like something had once happened there, like the trees had held witnesses but never spoken. He never found anything new. But he marked the tree again, this time with orange tape, just in case someone else came looking. Years later, when the real discovery came, The map was pulled from the archives and laid out again, creased, darkened, frayed at the edges. The symbol was still there, ink faded, but present. And the place it marked? Just a few miles from where the dog would dig, from where the roots would shift, from where silence would finally give way to something undeniable. 10 years passed. Trails changed, trees fell, people moved on. The Langstons became one of those stories that lived in quiet corners, revisited on anniversaries, whispered about at trailheads, folded into the growing collection of Smoky Mountain vanishings that had no clean ending. By 2023, the old side path that had once been central to the investigation had long since closed. It had grown over in places, reclaimed by underbrush, and was mostly forgotten, except by the few who still carried the weight of what hadn't been answered. One of those few was Michael Avery, a retired Knoxville police officer who'd worked cold cases for nearly 20 years. He wasn't part of the original Langston investigation, but he knew the file. He remembered the photo, the truck, the map. After retiring, he hiked often, mostly alone, sometimes with his German Shepherd Scout. He said the woods helped him think, kept the noise out. In October of 2023, Michael was walking a newly reopened section of trail near the northeast stretch of the park. The area had been closed off years earlier due to storm damage and erosion. Recent efforts had cleared it again, but it was still rarely used. That afternoon, the trail was empty. Scout stayed close at first, pacing ahead in measured bursts, sniffing brush and circling back. But halfway through the loop, something shifted. The dog froze, nose to the dirt near a root cluster at the base of a fallen tree. Not unusual, deer scent, fox dens, old burrows, but this time, Scout didn't move on. He growled low, then began to dig. Michael called him off, twice. The dog didn't listen, not fearfully, but with purpose. The digging was quick, methodical, more than curiosity. Dirt flew fast, roots exposed. Michael approached, ready to drag him away if needed. But as he stepped closer, something about the smell hit him, earthy but sharper, fainter, wrong. He pulled Scout back, scanned the ground, then knelt. What he saw wasn't conclusive. Just a glimpse of something pale under the soil, a curve, jagged, slightly discolored. He didn't touch it, he didn't want to. Instead, he marked the tree with orange tape from his pack, dropped a GPS pin, and walked the dog out without another word. He didn't report it immediately. He wanted to be sure. The next day, he reviewed the area on topographic maps. The spot was just outside the range marked on the old hand-drawn map found in the tree years earlier, the one with the circle and square. It wasn't exact, but it was close. Close enough. Michael contacted a former colleague who still worked in the forensic division and asked her to meet him the following week. Quietly. No press, no speculation. A week later, with proper clearance and a small team present, they returned. The same patch, the same root cluster. The dirt was damp, undisturbed since he'd left it. They began to dig slowly, carefully, using gloves and hand tools. Within minutes, they found what Scout had smelled, a bone, human, aged, fractured cleanly through the shaft. The outer surface was weathered, but unmistakable in structure. A femur, likely adult, partially wrapped in degraded synthetic fabric. Time had stained it dark, but the shape remained. Search protocol was activated immediately. The area was secured, the site flagged, and a full archaeological team was requested. Over the following days, they widened the dig. Soil samples were taken, artifacts cataloged, bones surfaced. One by one, not scattered, not dumped, but placed. The earth gave them up slowly, as if it had waited for the right hands. For 10 years, the search had centered on where the trail ended, where the prints stopped, where the scent went cold. And now, not far from that very place, the forest was finally speaking. The first confirmed human remains in the Langston case had surfaced, not by search grid, not by drone or infrared, but by a dog, retired like his handler, simply walking where few others did. What they found in that shallow grave was only the beginning. The bones told a partial story: age, trauma, time. The fabric fragments hinted at clothing, a torn zipper, a rusted belt clip, but there were no wallets, no phones, no wedding rings, nothing that said clearly who had been buried beneath the roots. Not yet. Michael stayed through the first week of the excavation, quiet, steady, respectful. He didn't say much. When asked later what he felt in the moment, he said this: "The woods don't give up secrets, not unless something pulls them loose." Scout returned once, days later, and sat by the tree without being told. He didn't dig again. He just waited, still and alert, nose low to the soil. It was enough. And for the families who had waited a decade with nothing, it was more than they ever expected. Something was finally in the light. Something had been hidden too long. The discovery didn't bring answers yet, but it cracked the silence open. And through that crack, for the first time in 10 years, the possibility of truth began to slip through. The roots told only part of the story. What lay beneath them was deeper, older, and more deliberate than anyone expected. As the forensic team widened the perimeter around the discovery site, they began to realize the soil hadn't just shifted over time. It had been layered, intentionally. Stones packed around the root system didn't match the natural scatter of the forest floor. They'd been placed, arranged, one layer flat, the next angled, as if building coverage without collapse. It looked less like a burial, and more like a cover. Something hidden, something someone had once hoped would stay that way. At 28 inches deep, they reached the first full set of skeletal remains, fully decomposed, humans, adults, likely male. Clothing remnants were reduced to threads and shreds of weathered canvas. The skull bore a sharp linear fracture across the left temple, clean, not from a fall, not from erosion, a break from force. Nearby, buried adjacent but lower, was a second mass, sealed in what had once been a vinyl tarp, double-wrapped and weighed down with stones. Time had done its damage, but enough of the seal remained that decomposition had slowed. When they opened it, the air changed. The second body was partially preserved, flesh gone, but some soft tissue mummified against the tarp's inner layer. The positioning was unnatural. Arms bent tight, legs twisted, head tucked sharply left. There were no bindings, no tape, no restraints. But it was a body that had not been laid down with care. It had been hidden, quickly, maybe, or desperately. As they worked, artifacts began to surface. The first came loose from the sidewall of the pit, a ring. Gold, slim, embedded with a single opal stone. It was Meredith's engagement ring, confirmed immediately by her sister, who'd helped Caleb choose it. Not a copy, the original, the one she had never been seen without. Then came a torn, faded jacket with a distinct patch sewn into the lining. Langston Track and Field. Caleb's. Worn, recognizable, irrefutable. These weren't just random remains. These were the Langstons, or at least part of them. But the most unexpected find came next. Inside the tarp, pressed beneath the collapsed rib cage, was a plastic ID badge, clouded with moisture, edges cracked but still legible. The name printed across it was Roger Dane Hollowell, and it didn't belong to Caleb or Meredith. Hollowell had vanished from the Smoky Mountains in 2002, 11 years before the Langstons. His case had gone unsolved. He'd been a seasonal forest contractor hired for short-term land surveys and infrastructure repair. He was known to hike alone, known to ignore protocols. His truck had been found abandoned just miles from this very spot. At the time, it was assumed he'd fallen into a ravine or gotten lost in an off-map sector. He was listed as a missing person and eventually presumed dead. No body had ever been found, until now. The discovery changed everything. This wasn't just a missing person recovery. It was now a potential crime scene involving at least 3 individuals across 2 decades. And the question no one could yet answer was how they were all connected and in what order. The forensics team documented the layers meticulously. Stratification confirmed that the skeletonized remains, Hollowell, had been buried first. The state of decomposition, depth of placement, and position all pointed to a much older interment. He had been dead for years before the Langstons ever entered the park. The fractured skull suggested homicide. But the real mystery lay in the fact that Meredith's engagement ring was found in the same burial pit, beneath the same canopy of roots, alongside Caleb's jacket, both placed near the tarp-wrapped second body believed to be hers. DNA testing would take weeks, but the circumstantial evidence was already leading investigators to a deeply disturbing timeline. Someone had buried Roger Hollowell. Someone had buried at least one of the Langstons in the same place, and that someone had known exactly where to go, had built the pit, placed the rocks, sealed the tarp, and left behind just enough to one day be found. The hunting knife surfaced last, near the edge of the pit, inside a decayed nylon sheath, still sharp enough to hold a reflection. The handle was cracked. No fingerprints survived. But the brand matched the description given years earlier by Dana Hollis, the bartender who had reported seeing Caleb and Meredith arguing with a man in hunting gear near the overlook. Her memory of the knife, she'd told investigators back then, came from a flash of the handle clipped to the man's belt. They hadn't believed her then. Now, they weren't so sure. The press learned of the discovery within days. Headlines were immediate. Langston remains found. Smoky Mountain cold case breaks open. Buried together, two timelines collide. But the headlines couldn't explain the burial site, the deliberate concealment, the ring that should have been on her hand, the badge from a decade earlier. Behind the scenes, investigators built a new case file from the bones upward. 3 names, 1 pit, no surviving witnesses. Yet the clues pointed toward something layered, planned, and human, not an accident, not misadventure, but sequence. Something or someone had bound these disappearances together. And now, with every stone pulled, with every bone lifted from the soil, the truth was surfacing. Not just about who had died, but maybe finally about who had survived, or worse, who had stayed hidden all along. The name on the ID badge, Roger Dane Hollowell, had long been buried in the archives. He'd disappeared in August of 2002, and though a missing persons file was opened, it had barely registered beyond a few counties. At the time, Hollowell had been working under a temporary Forest Service contract, trail maintenance, survey mapping, seasonal fire monitoring. He lived in his truck, slept off-grid, took cash jobs, and by most accounts, he kept to himself. But when the name resurfaced in 2023, so did the reason he'd quietly dropped off radar in the first place. An internal report from 2002 had documented an incident involving Hollowell and a female camper. She'd accused him of assault, an encounter that allegedly occurred near an isolated section of the park. The case never made it to trial. Hollowell left the county days later. When rangers searched his last known location, they found his truck unlocked, keys on the seat. No body, no note, no sign of a struggle. Just another man gone missing in the Smokies. There were no charges filed, no follow-up. By the time his badge showed up in a tarp-covered grave in 2023, the memory of his case had been nearly erased. Now, that same ID was key to understanding how Caleb and Meredith Langston had ended up buried in the same ground. Forensic analysts began reconstructing the timeline. Hollowell had likely died more than a decade before the Langstons ever entered the park. The trauma to his skull, the angle of the blade, wound near his ribs, deep, angled, delivered with force, indicated close-quarters violence. But more telling was where the weapon entered, not from behind, not from above, but directly to the chest. Defensive wounds lined the bones of his hands and forearms. He'd fought, and someone had fought back harder. The placement of the Langstons' remains told a second story. Meredith's body, now confirmed through DNA, had been wrapped. Caleb's bones lay loosely arranged nearby, closer to the surface, as if disturbed by time, erosion, or animal movement. But the clothing fragments, the proximity, and the presence of personal effects made the identification certain. The two of them had died here. The only question was how and why. Blood protein traces on the inside of the tarp were consistent with both Caleb and Meredith. But one additional element stood out. Embedded in a thin piece of preserved cloth was a small piece of serrated metal, matching the broken inner edge of the hunting knife found at the site. It wasn't rusted. It hadn't been there for 20 years. It was newer, more recent, likely damaged during a second struggle. The theory began to solidify. Meredith, faced with a violent threat, had killed Hollowell in self-defense. But then what? Why didn't they leave? Why weren't they found? The area where they were buried had been searched in 2013, but only narrowly. A small shift in the grid, a few yards missed, and beneath the surface, a hidden grave. One theory rose above the others, supported by physical evidence, behavioral patterns, and trauma reports. Caleb and Meredith had been held somewhere, trapped, concealed, cut off from help. Not for long, maybe a day, maybe two, but long enough. They'd escaped, wounded and frantic, and somehow during that chaos, Hollowell had been killed. But their injuries, or the elements, caught up with them first. The exposure data supported it. Caleb's remains showed signs of peri-mortem fracture, wounds consistent with a fall, a drop, a sharp impact. Meredith had bruising patterns preserved in the tissue against her arms and ribs, defensive posture. Cold temperatures in the following days could have finished what the violence started, and without anyone to help, the forest took them. The pit wasn't their hiding place, it was their end. But who buried them? That part remained unanswered. The working theory pointed back to Hollowell. He may have prepared the burial site in advance, whether for animal disposal, hiding contraband, or for reasons more sinister. When he was killed, the site became the place of all three deaths. Meredith and Caleb may have been trying to flee when they collapsed, or one may have tried to bury the other after the final moments. There were signs of care, an attempt at covering, a wrapping of the tarp, but no order, just desperation. What troubled investigators most was how Hollowell had stayed hidden for so long. There were signs that he'd been living in the forest well after his disappearance. Makeshift structures, supply caches, rusted traps near the same coordinates marked on the hand-drawn map. He had vanished from public life, but not from the woods. He was there, watching, waiting, maybe hunting, and in October 2013, he found them. The idea of an off-grid killer surviving undetected for over a decade seemed improbable, but the terrain made it possible. And the lack of oversight in those deeper zones, the very parts of the park with no trails, no signage, no foot traffic, meant Hollowell had room to disappear. He didn't need to be fast, he just needed to be quiet. And the forest did the rest. For the Langston families, the truth offered only partial relief. Their children had not run, had not chosen death, they had fought. Meredith, it seemed, had saved them, if only for a moment. The knife, the wounds, the position of the remains all pointed to her final act being one of defense. But no one could save them after that. No one even knew where to look. The file remained open for a short while longer. Investigators combed nearby sites, checked for accomplices, revisited every strange report from the past 2 decades. Nothing more surfaced. No one else emerged from the shadows. Hollowell was buried quietly, without ceremony. The Langstons were returned to Knoxville. In the end, the killer had been dead all along. The silence hadn't come from the forest protecting him, but from no one knowing he was even still there, hidden beneath trees, just waiting to be found. The final report left room for grief, but not for answers. DNA results confirmed what the families already knew in their bones, that the bodies recovered from beneath the roots belonged to Caleb and Meredith Langston. What couldn't be confirmed was how exactly they died. The autopsy listed probable exposure, possible trauma, but nothing definitive. There were fractures, yes, Caleb's shoulder, Meredith's ribs, but they could have come from a fall or a struggle or the weight of time pressing down in the dark. There were no ligatures, no gunshots, no poisons, just bodies buried where no one thought to dig until a dog broke the silence. The pit became a kind of altar, less for mourning and more for reckoning. 3 people had died there across 2 decades, one of them a predator, 2 of them a young couple who didn't run from life but were simply in the wrong place at the worst time. The soil held them close, the roots pressed down like fingers, and for 10 years, all of it had been hidden under a forest floor no one thought to question. Rangers placed a small memorial near the site, not an official marker, just a wooden post sanded smooth with 2 initials carved into the grain, C+M. It wasn't for tourists, it wasn't added to any maps, but those who knew the story visited quietly, leaving stones, pine cones, and small tokens beside the base. A hair tie, a hiking boot lace, a faded photo sealed in plastic. No one spoke loudly there. The case was closed quietly in the fall of 2023. The press covered the resolution for a week, enough to say closure had been found. But it wasn't the kind of closure that made people feel safe. It was the kind that reminded them how easily people could disappear, how silence could stretch for years without anyone breaking it, and how sometimes, even when the truth comes out, it does so in pieces, uneven, weathered, and incomplete. The families held a joint memorial back in Knoxville. Caleb's mother read a poem he'd written in college. Meredith's sister placed her engagement ring in a shallow bowl of water near the altar. The ceremony was quiet. No speeches, no accusations, just stillness. What they needed wasn't justice. It was permission to grieve what had already been gone for so long. It was one of the forensics techs, working late on evidence cataloging, who found the message. He'd been documenting the remnants of the tarp Meredith had been wrapped in, noting discoloration and areas of preservation, when he noticed something shallow but deliberate carved into the inner layer. It was faint, nearly missed under the folds and grime. 3 short lines. The first read, "We tried." The second, "We fought." And the third, "We're here." There was no signature, no date, but the spacing, the pressure, the slant of the lettering, it was enough. Experts later confirmed the handwriting matched Meredith's journal entries from a notebook recovered from their cabin. It had been her final act. Not a scream, not a cry, a record, a trace, something left behind not for rescue, but for remembrance. Proof that they hadn't given up, that they hadn't just vanished, that they mattered. The message spread quietly. It wasn't released to the public in full, just referenced in a press statement as a written indication of survival and resistance. But those closest to the case knew the truth. The message was real. And it had changed how they spoke about the Langstons from that point forward, not as victims, but as witnesses. Rangers returned to the tree where the dog had stopped and marked it discreetly. They called it the telling tree after that, an internal nickname, never formalized. The roots had held so much, not just bodies but history, secrets, choices, and silence, the kind that builds when no one is listening, until a paw scratches just deep enough to make the world look again. Locals still talk about that patch of woods, not with fear necessarily, but with caution. They say it's quiet in a strange way, that birds avoid the air above it, that sometimes, even now, you can feel something shift under your boots, like the earth remembering. Some swear they've seen a red truck far off in the distance, even though Hollowell's was never recovered. Others say a man in camo still walks the ridges, watching, waiting. None of it's proven. But the Smokies have always carried their own stories, and not all of them end in daylight. In the years since, the trail where the Langstons entered has been renamed, not after them, but rerouted, quietly absorbed into a new loop with different signage. It's safer now, wider, marked more clearly. But if you ask a ranger about the Langstons, they'll still pause, still glance toward the North Ridge, because even though the case is closed, the woods still hold echoes, not voices, just the feeling that something was interrupted and something else was left behind. That's what the tree remembers, the roots, the bones, the message carved not for rescue but for truth. We tried, we fought, we're here. A final story written not in ink but in silence, and found only because one dog refused to leave.